Let's take a closer look at one of the earliest and most devastating federal policies in American educational history. The Indian Civilization Act of 1819 shaped not only the education of Native children, but also the long-term relationship between indigenous communities and the U.S. government. First, the act funded missionary-run Indian schools, using federal dollars to support religious institutions that promised to educate Native children. But this education was less about academics and more about cultural erasure. These schools were explicitly aimed at civilizing Native children, a phrase rooted in white supremacist ideas that equated indigenous cultures with savagery and European norms with progress. In practice, these schools erased languages, cultures, and traditions. Native children were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing spiritual customs. Over time, many lost the ability to communicate with elders or participate in cultural ceremonies. These institutions punished Native identity and praised Eurocentrism. Children had their hair cut, their names changed, and were often shamed or physically punished for expressing any part of their heritage. Beyond the classroom, this system broke families and tribal structures. Children were often taken from their homes, sometimes by force, disrupting the transfer of knowledge, tradition, and identity from one generation to the next. The Indian Civilization Act set a precedent for the later boarding school system, which expanded these efforts on a massive scale throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Schools like Carlisle became famous for their motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Today, the trauma still impacts Native youth, from intergenerational grief to mistrust of educational institutions, which continues to be a living reality in many indigenous communities. This act reminds us that education is never neutral. It can be used as a tool of empowerment or as a weapon of cultural destruction. As educators, we must tell the full story and work to ensure that history never repeats itself. One of the most important turning points in American education and in civil rights history was the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This case reshaped the legal, moral, and educational landscape of the United States. First and foremost, the ruling declared separate but equal unconstitutional. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which had allowed racial segregation to flourish under the false premise that black and white schools could be equal while still being separate. Brown versus Board of Education sparked desegregation in public education, legally requiring schools to begin integrating black and white students. It marked a powerful step toward dismantling institutionalized racism in schools. But that change did not come easily. The decision faced major resistance, especially in the South. Some districts delayed integration for years, while others shut down public schools altogether to avoid compliance. Students who integrated were often met with violence, hostility, and isolation. This legal victory opened the doors for civil rights legislation, laying the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Education reform became part of a broader movement for racial justice. Brown versus Board of Education promised equity, but those promises have not all been fulfilled. Today, many schools remain segregated by race and income, and disparities in funding, discipline, and access to opportunity still persist. However, Brown versus the Board of Education inspired multicultural and inclusive curricula. Educators began to question whose voices were being centered in textbooks and classrooms. The idea that every child deserves to see themselves reflected in their education began to take root. At its heart, Brown versus Board of Education affirmed a foundational truth. Education is a right, not a privilege. It said to generations of students that their worth is not determined by their zip code or the color of their skin, and that equal opportunity must be guaranteed by law. This case reminds us that the fight for educational justice is ongoing and that legal change must be accompanied by cultural and systemic change in our classrooms. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, passed in 1975, was a groundbreaking shift in American education. Before IDEA, over 1 million children with disabilities were excluded from public schools. Many more were isolated in underfunded, inappropriate settings. This law marked a new era in equity and inclusion. Most importantly, IDEA guaranteed every child the right to a free, appropriate public education. That meant schools could no longer deny access based on a disability. All students were entitled to meaningful learning opportunities. To ensure these opportunities were tailored to each student's needs, IDEA required the development of individualized education plans, or IEPs. These documents outlined a student's unique learning goals and the specific services and supports the school must provide. IDEA also ensured access to the least restrictive learning environment. That means students with disabilities should be educated alongside their non disabled peers whenever possible, not isolated unless absolutely necessary. The law protected the legal rights of both students and their parents, giving families a voice in the decision making process. Due process rights allowed them to advocate for services, challenge placement decisions, and hold schools accountable. Over time, IDEA increased inclusion and expanded support services in schools, from speech therapy and counseling to classroom aids and modified instruction. These supports helped more students thrive in general education settings. IDEA shifted the national mindset from exclusion to equity. It changed how we think about ability, potential, and belonging. It reminded educators that disability is not a deficit, it's a different way of learning. The impact of IDEA continues in today's classrooms. We see it in co-teaching models, inclusive classrooms, and the ongoing work of creating accessible learning environments for all students, especially those at potential or historically marginalized. IDEA didn't just open the school doors, it reshaped what equity looks like inside the classroom and reminded us that justice in education must be intentional, individualized, and inclusive. The Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, passed in 2015, which introduced a long overdue update to federal education policy. It came as a response to the growing criticism of No Child Left Behind and aimed to balance accountability with flexibility, especially for schools serving at potential populations. ESSA replaced No Child Left Behind, which had become synonymous with high stakes testing and punitive accountability measures. No Child Left Behind's one size fits all approach had pushed many schools and students to the breaking point. In contrast, ESSA gave states more control over education standards and accountability systems. States could now decide how to measure school performance and intervene in struggling schools, giving more local power to design solutions. It also reduced federal testing pressure. While annual testing in math and reading remained, ESSA allowed states to use multiple measures of success and move away from harsh consequences tied solely to test results. One of the law's most important goals was to emphasize equity for underserved students, including students of color, English learners, students with disabilities, and those from low-income families. Schools are now required to track subgroup performance and intervene when those groups are not making progress. Unlike No Child Left Behind, ESSA also include non-academic success indicators like school climate, student engagement, and access to advanced coursework, recognizing that learning is more than test scores. ESSA also increased funding for English learners in Title I schools, aiming to close opportunity gaps by directing more resources to students who have historically been left behind. But despite these changes, ESSA is still debated. Critics argue it's just a repackaged version of No Child Left Behind, with some softer language. Others believe it opened the door for real reform, depending on how states choose to implement it. ESSA reminds us that policy alone doesn't ensure progress. It depends on how we use it. Equity, flexibility, and accountability must work together if we want all students, not just some, to succeed. As a high school history educator, I don't just want to teach facts. I want to teach truth. I want my students to understand the past not as something distant or abstract, but as something that continues to shape the world they live in right now. I want to challenge them to think critically, to ask hard questions, and to see themselves as participants in history, not just observers. Studying these four key events, the Indian Civilization Act, Brown versus Board of Education, IDEA, and ESSA, has deeply transformed how I view teaching and learning history. Learning about the Indian Civilization Act showed me that history is not neutral. It has wounds. Education wasn't always about enlightenment. Sometimes it was used to erase entire cultures, languages, and identities. I now realize that education has been used as a weapon, from boarding schools to segregated classrooms. Systems of education have historically marginalized the very students we now call at potential. Brown versus Board of Education and IDEA help me see that laws can either silence or protect. Whether we're talking about race or disability, legal decisions matter, and they shape student access, inclusion, and dignity. ESSA taught me that equity requires more than access. It's not just about being allowed in the building, it's about what happens once you're inside. Are you seen? Are you supported? Taken together, these events help me understand that past harm explains present disparities. If we don't teach students the truth of what came before, we can't help them navigate what they face now. That's why I believe teaching must heal, not just inform. History class should be a space where students see their stories reflected and respected, because ultimately, students need truth to shape the future. I want to give them that truth and the tools to build something better. Let's take a step back to the 1830s and 1840s, when public education as we know it was just beginning to take shape. This era is known as the Common School Movement, and it laid the groundwork for America's public school system. The movement was championed by Horace Mann, often called the father of American education. He believed education was the great equalizer and a way to create a more moral, stable society. Mann and other reformers pushed for tax-funded, free public schools, arguing that every child, not just the wealthy, deserved a basic education paid for by the public good. These schools were designed to build moral and civic citizens, especially among the working class and immigrant children, teaching obedience, patriotism, and Protestant values. They used a uniform curriculum and strict discipline to mold students into productive, law abiding citizens. But this also meant suppressing cultural diversity and enforcing conformity. While the movement expanded access, it also excluded many children, especially African American students, Native children, those with disabilities, and others outside the white, able bodied norm. Common didn't mean equal. One lasting impact was the standardization of teacher training. Normal schools were created to prepare teachers in a uniform way, establishing a professional identity for educators. Today, the legacy of the common school movement still influences the structure of public schools, from grade levels and bells to standardized curriculum, but many of the same equity issues persist. While the movement aimed to democratize education, it also embedded systemic inequities that continue to shape the experiences of at potential students today. The progressive era, spanning from 1890s to 1920s, was a time of major social and educational reform, and it still shapes how we teach today. One of its defining contributions was the emphasis on child centered, hands on learning. Instead of passive memorization, students were encouraged to explore, question, and interact with real world problems. This shift was championed by thinkers like John Dewey, who believed schools should prepare students not just for work, but for life in a democratic society. He called schools miniature communities and emphasized experiential learning. Reformers during this period challenged rote memorization and recitation, which had dominated classrooms. They introduced group work, problem solving, and critical thinking, techniques we now see in project based and inquiry driven classrooms. The movement also promoted access to public kindergartens, libraries, playground, and school lunches. These ideas treated education as more than academic, it was social and developmental. But while the progressive era was revolutionary in theory, in practice it excluded many students, especially African American children, immigrant children, and those with disabilities. Progress often served middle class white children most directly. Still, this period laid the groundwork for modern pedagogy. The idea that students are not blank slates, but active participants in their own learning. It reshaped teacher preparation and classroom design. Today, we still see the impact of the progressive era in student focused instruction, SEL initiatives, and whole child education approaches. But we're still working to extend these benefits to all students, especially those who were left out the first time. Let's talk about the civil rights desegregation era, a transformative yet deeply complicated period in American education history, especially for at potential students. It begins with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This was a legal turning point for educational equity. The decision outlawed segregation in public schools, but implementation was far from smooth. Many schools, particularly in the South, resisted for years, sometimes violently. The resistance was organized and widespread, known as massive resistance. White families pulled their children out of public schools, and some districts even shut schools down entirely to avoid integration. Meanwhile, African American students were sent to integrate white schools, often alone and without support. They faced hostility, isolation, physical danger, all while trying to learn. In the process, many black schools were closed, and African American teachers and principals were fired, even though they were highly qualified. This erased community institutions and role models that had supported generations of African American students. Despite these setbacks, the era led to landmark civil rights legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and helped drive federal education reforms that aimed to address inequality. But the story doesn't end there. Many schools today remain segregated by race, income, and district lines. Equity gaps in funding, opportunity, and discipline still impact at potential students, especially students of color. This era reminds us that legal victories don't guarantee justice and that real educational equity takes sustained commitment, accountability, and inclusion. The standards and accountability era began in earnest with the 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, which warned that American schools were failing to prepare students for global competition. The report sparked a national panic and led to sweeping calls for higher academic expectations across the board, especially in math, science, and reading. The solution? Raise the bar and measure student achievement through standardized testing benchmarks. Test results were now seen as proof of school success or failure. This culminated the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which mandated annual testing in reading and math and required schools to show adequate yearly progress for all student subgroups. But in practice, this era put enormous pressure on low income, racially diverse schools, which often lacked the resources to meet rising expectations and faced harsh penalties for underperformance. To avoid failing scores, many schools narrowed the curriculum, cutting art, music, social studies, and enrichment programs, especially in at potential communities, just to focus on test prep. While it claimed to close achievement gaps, this approach often widened opportunity gaps by reducing access to a well rounded education. Even today, the legacy of this era still shapes how we test, fund, and evaluate schools, though newer laws like ESSA try to address some of its failings. This period reminds us that accountability without equity doesn't serve all learners, especially those already facing barriers. It shows why we must measure success not just by test scores, but by growth, opportunity, and dignity. As a high school history educator, I used to think my job was just to help students understand what happened in the past. But now I know that teaching history is also about helping them understand why the present looks the way it does. These major developmental periods in American education have profoundly changed how I view the system we have today and how I'll teach moving forward. I've learned that teaching history means confronting hard truths. Many reforms we celebrate had deep flaws, and it's my responsibility to present both the progress and the harm. For example, the Common School movement, while it laid the foundation for public education, wasn't built for everyone. It excluded many, especially students of color, immigrants, and those with disabilities. The progressive era, with all its innovation, still left too many kids behind. Its reforms mostly served white middle class students, and it often reinforced social hierarchies rather than dismantling them. The desegregation era showed us that policy progress doesn't always mean justice. Schools were legally integrated, but many African American educators lost their jobs, and students were placed into hostile environments with little support. During the standards and accountability era, I saw how reforms meant to close gaps actually deepened patterns of inequality, especially when testing narrowed the curriculum for at potential learners. What I've come to understand is that equity can't come from surface level reform alone. It requires a deep shift in how we see students, value their cultures, and measure success. Ultimately, I believe we must teach truth to empower change. That means telling the full story, not to shame the past, but to equip the next generation to build something better. The philosophy of American education has shifted dramatically over time, from a system focused on conformity and moral instruction to one that increasingly values equity, individuality, and critical thinking. Early education, Common School movement, emphasized moral training, obedience, and civic duty, with a one size fits all model designed to assimilate students into a unified national culture. Progressive era reformers like John Dewey introduced child centered learning, experiential education, and the idea that schools should prepare students for democratic life, not just work. Mid 20th century civil rights reforms expanded the focus to include access, equity, and legal protections, especially for marginalized groups, including students of color and those with disabilities. Late 20th century to early 2000s standards and accountability era saw a shift toward outcomes based education, standardized testing, and data driven accountability, often at the expense of holistic learning. Contemporary philosophy emphasizes inclusion, culturally responsive teaching, social emotional learning, and preparing students for a complex, globalized world. There's a growing recognition that education must address systematic inequities and support the whole child. As a high school history educator, I realized that teaching history isn't just about dates and documents, it's about helping students see how power, policy, and philosophy have shaped their world. Also, the more I studied educational history, the more I began to rethink what kind of teacher I want to be. I've come to understand that education has never been neutral. From the Indian Civilization Act to segregated schools and test based reforms, education has always reflected the value and the biases of society's elite. I've also learned that reform without equity can harm learners. Even well meaning efforts like the Common School or progressive movements excluded students based on race, class, language, or ability. The civil rights era made it clear to me that access alone doesn't ensure justice. Laws like Brown versus Board of Education open doors, but real equity requires support systems, cultural inclusion, and respect. The standards and accountability era taught me that standardized testing isn't true success. Tests don't measure creativity, resilience, or potential, and often punish the very students they claim to serve. I now believe that all students deserve dignity and voice, not just academic support, but validation of their identities, languages, and lived experiences in the classroom. That's why I view learning as a tool for critical thinking and empowerment, not just memorization. History should teach students how to ask bold questions and challenge injustice. In my classroom, I will center truth and equity. We won't avoid hard histories, we'll confront them because understanding the past is how we shape a better future. As someone preparing to teach high school history, I've come to see that teaching the past without honoring culture and heritage is incomplete. History doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens to people, families, and communities shaped by their identities. Understanding that has reshaped my entire philosophy of education. I believe that history must honor all lived experiences, not just the dominant narratives we find in textbooks. That means intentionally including Indigenous, African American, immigrant, and other marginalized voices. I also recognize that students bring their cultures into the classroom. Their language, religion, traditions, and family stories all impact how they learn, what they value, and how they relate to the material. A student's identity shapes how they see content. When history erases their heritage, it sends a message that their lives don't matter or that they're just footnotes in someone else's story. Ignoring culture creates disconnection. When students don't see themselves represented or respected, they disengage, not because they don't care, but because they don't feel seen. But when we create space for culture, inclusion leads to belonging, and belonging leads to stronger participation, confidence, and academic growth. Including diverse voices enriches historical thinking, helping all students ask better questions and see history through multiple lenses, not just the one handed down by power. That's why I say this with conviction. I teach to affirm, not erase stories. My classroom will be a place where every student's history matters because education should be a reflection of who we are, not a tool to flatten us into who we're told to be. As someone preparing to teach history and perhaps geography too, I've been thinking a lot about how technology, especially virtual reality or VR, is reshaping not only how we learn, but how we experience the world. Here's what I believe the future of education looks like. Technology will personalize and expand learning. With digital tools, students can learn at their own pace, revisit complex ideas, and explore topics that spark their curiosity. Tools like AI will support differentiated instruction, helping teachers reach diverse learners, including at potential students, with real time feedback, adaptive content, and translation support for multilingual classrooms. But what excites me most is how VR will deepen historical understanding. Imagine students walking through ancient ruins, witnessing a civil rights protest, or standing in a trench during World War I, not just reading about it, but feeling it. VR lets students explore cultures instead of just reading about them. They can visit global landmarks, sit in on cultural rituals, or even interview avatars representing historical figures in immersive environments. When it comes to geography, VR transforms the map into a lived experience. Students can fly over the Andes, explore a desert ecosystem, or trace migration routes in 3D spaces, making abstract concepts real. Of course, this future isn't guaranteed. Equity will depend on access to technology and teacher training. Without it, the digital divide could grow. That's why tech must be a tool for justice, not just convenience. In this new era, teachers must become guides, not just content deliverers. We help students make sense of what they experience, connect it to real world issues, and develop empathy alongside knowledge. As a history and geography educator, I see globalization not just as an economic force, but as a cultural and educational one. It's reshaping how students learn, what they learn, and why it matters. Globalization encourages global citizenship and awareness. Students are no longer just citizens of one country, they're part of a global community. Education must help them think beyond borders. It also expands cultural perspectives. Through global content and cross cultural interactions, students learn empathy, communication, and appreciation for people whose lives look very different from their own. But globalization also increases the demand for digital and global skills. Things like cross linguistic communication, media literacy, and collaboration across time zones. Schools have to adapt quickly to prepare students for that world. We're also seeing how curriculum is shaped by international influence through global standards and through social movements that connect classrooms across continents. However, globalization also highlights inequality in tech access, teacher training, and the ability to connect across the digital divide. These gaps must be addressed for global learning to be truly equitable. On the positive side, globalization promotes collaboration across nations and cultures through global projects, international partnerships, and digital exchanges. Students can work with peers in other countries, opening minds and expanding possibilities. Through this journey into the history of education, my understanding of what it means to teach and to truly reach students has changed profoundly. Now I see that teaching is never neutral. It's shaped by the legacies of reform, exclusion, resistance, and resilience. Understanding historical moments like the Common School movement, desegregation, and accountability reform has helped me recognize the importance of centering equity in everything I do. I've also learned that culture and heritage are not side notes in education, they are foundational. Students carry their stories, languages, and identities into the classroom, and I have a responsibility to honor and include them in the learning process. Globalization and technology, especially tools like virtual reality, have expanded what's possible in education. They offer powerful ways to engage students in history and geography, not just through facts, but through experience and empathy. But they also demand that we stay mindful of equity, access, and purpose. Ultimately, I no longer see my role as simply delivering content. I see myself as a guide who helps students explore their world, question the past, and shape a better future. Teaching is not just about learning outcomes, it's about liberation, inclusion, and transformation. I have two questions I would like to ask. If you are seeing this on YouTube, feel free to put your answers or suggestions in the comments. The first question is, what do we risk when we teach history without acknowledging the harm caused by past education policies? The second question is, what would it look like to teach history in a way that heals rather than harms? Please take a moment to look over the references in this presentation.